Right, hi everybody, welcome back. This video makes up the second part of topic 7.1, and in this one I want to look at energy choices and security. In the first part I looked at what choices are available in terms of energy supply, and in this one I want to discuss how you make those choices and what level of energy security those choices give to a country. Okay, so before I start, it's just worth defining, I think, energy security. I think it's obvious what energy choices mean. But I looked up a few definitions, and the one I found that I think was most relevant was written by the International Energy Agency, and it defines energy security as the ability of a country to maintain uninterrupted supply of energy despite external factors, and therefore keep the economy moving. So when we look at energy choices and energy security, we'll be looking at these things you can see above my head, these main key terms. Energy choices are made in terms of the availability of the energy, its sustainability. Sometimes part of the culture of a society will determine what energy choices it makes. Politics plays a role, and economics, of course. In fact, economics is a big driving force. And more these days, environmental factors. And energy security is related to adequate supply, reliable supply, affordable supply, and the ability of an economy to become independent from external factors. Okay, so as usual, I want to start by looking at the syllabus. I'll read it very quickly. Pretty much, I've taken the keywords directly from the syllabus, so I don't want to repeat myself too much. But it says in terms of first of all, security. Energy security depends on adequate, reliable, and affordable supply of energy that provides independence, as I've already said. However, there is an inequitable availability and uneven distribution of energy source, and therefore that can lead to conflict on the road to achieving energy security. And then under that it says that energy choices, this time, are adopted by society, may be influenced by their availability, sustainability, scientific and technological developments, culture, political, economic, and environmental factors. And these in turn can have an effect on energy security and independence. Okay, and then finally, they've put in here, it's kind of a throwaway comment, but it's pretty obvious. One big factor that can influence energy security is efficiency of use. So therefore, if you can conserve energy, you can contribute to greater energy security. Under applications and skills, we need to discuss factors that affect the choices, discuss factors that affect energy security, and then finally evaluate the energy strategy of a given society. I've decided here that I'll do a case study, and I'll look particularly at Mexico and Mexico's energy security, and therefore Mexico's energy choices over the last few years. Okay, so before I show you one slide on choices and one slide on security pretty much, I just wanted to recap what I pretty much said in the previous video about energy consumption. First of all, well, some of these are very obvious. MEDCs use more energy per capita than LEDCs. The economies of MEDCs are based on high technology, high energy use, and MEDCs have therefore become dependent on high fossil fuel use. LEDC economies generally have less available technology, and as well because of their culture are more dependent on fuels like wood, biomass and biofuels, generally less use of fossil fuels. And then finally, in general, well, not in general, as a fact, energy consumption is still increasing year on year. The use of fossil fuels is therefore still increasing, but the proportion that MEDCs use from renewables in particular is increasing as well. At the moment, only somewhere between 20 and 25% of all energy use is provided from renewable energy. Hopefully that proportion will continue to increase in the future. Okay, energy security. Well, I don't need to repeat what I've already said. It depends on adequacy, reliability, affordability, and the ability to give an economy independence from outside factors. And also, energy security is helped by increasing the efficiency of energy use and conservation, particularly of fossil fuels. At the lower rate that we use fossil fuels, the longer they'll be available. And then finally, to a large degree, the need for energy security was driven by what happened in the early 1970s, or what we could call the energy crisis of 1973 to 74, which I want to talk a little bit about now because it has a big effect on national policies today. If you really want to read about this subject, you really have to read this book, which is a Pulitzer Prize winning book by the economist and author Daniel Yergin. It's called The Prize. This is my copy I've just pulled off the shelf. But my copy is from 1991. So when he published this, that was before obviously before 9/11, before the Second Gulf War, and before the current level of energy instability we have at the moment, which I'll mention a bit later. But I would recommend reading that book, probably the later editions. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about the energy crisis of 73 to 74. So it began in October 1973, and it began when the members of OPEC, which is basically a cartel of oil-producing nations, of which the original members were 5, I think, which were, let me see, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Iraq, Iran, and Kuwait. They were the original members of OPEC. And after the Yom Kippur War, in which Arab countries started a war with Israel to try to win back parts of Palestine that Israel had annexed in the 1960s. What happened after that war, which was won by Israel, the OPEC countries put an embargo on countries that had supported Israel in that war, which were principally, originally, Japan, Canada, the Netherlands, UK, and USA. And OPEC had realised that oil supply to those MEDCs could be a political weapon. So those countries, and then a few other countries that followed, they were faced with a huge oil deficit where they couldn't import enough oil to meet the demands of their economy. By March 1974, the price of oil had gone up 300%. If you Google it, the picture you'll always find of the crisis is American pumping stations where gasoline was rationed and not available on certain times of the week. It was never put into law, but Nixon pressured oil companies to start to ration petrol use. By March 1974, pretty much the crisis was over because led by the Americans, these MEDCs that I mentioned before managed to negotiate a deal with the OPEC countries. But by then, a lot of damage had been done. There'd been a huge, big recession. The stock market had crashed. The price of the dollar had dropped considerably. And there was a huge effect on economies around the world, particularly the US economy. In some parts of the US, gasoline prices had risen by about 40%. And some states were unable to light their streets. And in fact, some states, I believe, banned Christmas lights in Christmas of 1974. So, although the embargo was lifted in 1974, in March 1974, there were long-lasting effects, and it kind of convinced a lot of MEDCs that they needed energy security. They couldn't be dependent on foreign sources of oil. Of course, at this time and still today, we're an oil-based economy. So there was a big drive to provide energy security. Okay, in terms of what drives energy security, well, GDP has a big say. If you have a big economy, you probably need greater energy security. There's a historical basis, certainly. Fossil fuels are what we've become dependent on, especially after the Industrial Revolution. Greater car use in MEDCs and greater transport means greater dependence on petroleum. Some countries have tried to meet energy security by moving away from fossil fuels and more towards nuclear. The UK, about 20% of energy currently is supplied by nuclear. Same more or less in the US. Mexico has two nuclear power plants, which supply about 4% of national energy requirements. One exception is France, which provides most of its energy from nuclear, 78%. Japan was very dependent on nuclear power until recently, until the Fukushima disaster of 2011. And Japan has actually, as a result, just started to close down all of its nuclear reactors. But certainly one way towards meeting energy security is to move towards nuclear power. I've said here, a big problem with energy security is that as a society, certainly in MEDCs, we're quite resistant to change. And also change comes with a cost. If you want to invest these days in for example, an electric car, you have to shell out a lot of money up front because it's a developing technology. And if you want to invest in developing technology, there's a big capital cost up front. Okay, I've said here, again in MEDCs, some people are resistant to live close to renewables, specifically wind power, because it's in some places it's seen as a blight on the landscape, or it can be seen as damaging the environment due to bird kills, things like that. However, on the other side of the coin, there is more awareness these days of the damage that reliance on fossil fuels is causing to our planet, particularly in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. Okay. And then finally, I promised a case study, and I wanted to look at Mexico. So most countries that they have energy security plans. Usually they introduce 5-year plans, and Mexico introduced its last 5-year plan in 2016. So a few things about this plan. First of all, Mexico's population is currently about 125 million, expected to rise to 150 million by 2050. So Mexico has a growing population with therefore increasing energy demands. Mexico has a nationalized oil industry, which is called Pemex. But currently, Pemex doesn't have great expertise in, certainly in the exploitation of very deep oil wells. So the Mexican government, not just this current government in 2020, but previous governments, are trying to open up the oil industry to foreign investors because they have the expertise to exploit more oil from Mexican oil fields. However, there's a big public drive, big public demand to keep Pemex nationalised. So at the moment, the government is very carefully trying to open up the markets, but leaving Pemex in charge of Mexican oil. Currently, Mexico is fairly dependent on the importation of natural gas from the US. I believe about 65% currently of all the gas that Mexico uses for energy production is dependent on natural gas imported from the US. And a big part of Mexico's energy security is going to have to be based on trying to stop corruption, first of all, and the theft of fuel, particularly petroleum. I think this is a reliable figure. I just looked up in, I think it was Universal. In 2019, it's estimated that at least, and probably a lot more actually, at least 13 billion pesos of petroleum was stolen in that 1 year. Okay. The government is also committed to trying to meet its obligations to the Paris Accord and therefore reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. And Mexico is also trying to push the proportion of energy that is supplied by renewable sources. You probably know this, but Mexico is a huge country which is hugely biodiverse, not only in terms of its biology, but also diverse in terms of its terrain and the availability of natural resources and renewables. Mexico has desert in the north, and rainforest in the south, and everything in between. And it has every kind of resource you would need to try to exploit in terms of renewable energy. Hydroelectric. Currently, I believe about 4% of Mexico's energy is supplied by hydroelectric power. Wind power, I'm not sure about that proportion, but I know there's a huge wind farm off the coast of Oaxaca. Obviously, especially in the north, great availability of solar power. So there is certainly renewables available and renewable resources available to exploit. Okay, I'm not sure if I've done justice to the list of things we need to cover that I covered at the start from the syllabus, but I think this is just a starting point to a discussion we can have in the classroom. So I hope it was helpful, and I'll speak to you in our class. All right, take care, everybody.